1347. Imagine walking through a medieval European street. The air is thick with fear. Doors are nailed shut and carts roll by filled with bodies. People whisper about an invisible curse spreading like wildfire. This was the Black Death, a mysterious plague that killed nearly 50 million people in just a few years. But this wasn't just a disease. It was a force that would tear down kingdoms, fuel superstition, and forever reshape the world we live in today. The Black Death did not begin in Europe, though that is where it left its deepest scar. Its dark journey started far away, across the windswept grasslands of Central Asia. There, among caravans and armies, life and death mingled daily. Few realized that in the fur of black rats, tiny fleas were carrying an invisible assassin. For years, the disease traveled silently along the Silk Road, the great trade route that connected east and west. With every merchant's wagon, every soldier's march, every sack of grain, the plague crept further, hidden from human eyes. Then came the fateful autumn of 1347. In October, a dozen trading ships arrived at the bustling port of Messina in Sicily. Locals rushed to greet them, excited by exotic goods, stories from distant lands, and the wealth these vessels promised. But joy turned to horror. The sailors were barely alive. Their skin was blotched, their bodies covered in swollen black sores. Many lay already dead below deck. Within hours, fear spread faster than fire. The port tried to drive the ships away, but it was too late. The invisible killer had landed. From Sicily, the plague leapt mercilessly from town to town, across Italy into France and Spain, and soon to every corner of Europe. The unseen enemy had arrived, and no one was prepared for what followed. The plague was cruel. It began with the fever and chills. Then came the swollen black lumps called buboes that gave the disease its name. Victims coughed blood. Their skin turned dark, and most died within 3 days. Entire towns were wiped out. In some villages, there weren't enough living to bury the dead. Streets echoed with the wheels of death carts as plague doctors, masked in their terrifying beaked costumes, moved among the sick. The sight was enough to break the strongest souls. When people couldn't explain the plague, fear turned to madness. Some believed it was God's punishment for sins. Others blamed foreigners, Jews, or witches. In the streets, mobs hunted scapegoats. Entire communities were burned. At the same time, groups of flagellants paraded through towns, whipping themselves to beg for God's mercy. Medicine was helpless. Doctors used herbs, strange masks, even leeches. But nothing worked. The plague laughed at their efforts. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, Europe was no longer the same continent it had once been. Nearly half the population was gone. Entire towns had vanished. Villages stood empty, and families were reduced to memories carved in stone. The silence that followed was haunting. Fields lay abandoned, harvests rotted where they stood, and churches echoed with prayers for the dead rather than hymns of joy. Yet from this unimaginable despair came transformation. With so few workers left alive, those who remained found themselves with unexpected power. Peasants who had once been bound to the land, voiceless and disposable, now demanded higher wages, better conditions, and freedom from their lords. Some left their villages entirely, traveling to cities in search of opportunity. For the first time in centuries, the rigid chains of feudalism began to crack. Trade slowed, Yes, but ideas began to move in new ways. Survivors questioned the world they lived in, their faith, and even the role of the church, which had promised salvation but failed to stop the plague. Art shifted, literature darkened, and medicine, still primitive, took its first uncertain steps towards science. Many historians argue that without the devastation of the plague, Europe might never have seen the Renaissance. The death of millions created space for rebirth, a rebirth in art, in science, in philosophy, and in the very way people saw themselves in the world. The Black Death was a tragedy beyond imagination. It scarred generations, destroyed societies, and brought Europe to its knees. But it was also paradoxically a reset, a terrible storm that cleared the ground for something new to grow. It was, in the end, not just a disease, but a turning point in human history. The Black Death was more than just a disease. It was a living nightmare, a shadow that crept across continents, leaving nothing untouched. It was a monster without a face, without mercy, that tore through cities and villages alike. But as much as it destroyed, it also reshaped civilization. It left scars that can still be felt centuries later, in our medicine, our science, our art, even in the way we understand life and death itself. It forced humanity to grow, to adapt, and to question everything it thought it knew about faith, power, and survival. Imagine for a moment, if you had lived in that time, would you have been one of the survivors clawing your way through fear and despair? Or would you have become one of its countless victims, remembered only as a number in history's darkest chapter? The Black Death was not just the story of death, it was the story of resilience, transformation, and the human spirit's ability to rise, even from ashes. And if this story has captivated you, know this: there are countless more waiting. Tales of forgotten empires, cursed relics, forbidden rituals, and secrets buried deep in the shadows of history. If you want more stories like this, dark, mysterious, and unforgettable, then subscribe to the Sepulcher Echoes. Because history's darkest echoes are not silent, they are still waiting to be heard.